She cried on her wedding night. Not because her new husband had hurt her. Not because he had shouted or raised a hand against her. He hadn't done any of those things. He hadn't even touched her. He had simply stood in the doorway of the little log cabin, looking at her for one long moment before quietly turning away. Then he walked outside, closed the door behind him, and left his 19-year-old bride alone. She listened as his boots disappeared into the darkness. She waited for them to come back. They never did. That was the moment Abigail Foster buried her face in the pillow and cried until sunrise. She had married a man the entire town feared, a mountain rancher who spoke less in a month than most men spoke before breakfast. Everyone believed he was hard. Everyone believed she had been sacrificed. Even Abigail believed it. What she didn't know was that before another year had passed, the same man she feared would risk everything he had to save her. And the real reason he walked out of that cabin on their wedding night was a secret so heartbreaking that no one in Willow Creek had ever guessed it. Stay with me until the end, because when Abigail finally discovered the truth, she realized she had spent months fearing the one man who had been protecting her from the very first night. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Abigail Foster had not chosen the marriage. Hunger had chosen it for her. The winter before had ruined her father's small farm outside Willow Creek. 2 fields never produced. Their last meal died before spring. By summer, every valuable thing inside the house had been sold except the family Bible and the wedding dress hanging inside her mother's cedar chest. When Silas Carter sent word through the town preacher that he wanted a wife, people talked about little else. Some said he was too wild to live among decent folk. Others claimed he had once fought 3 men outside a logging camp and walked away without a scratch. Nobody agreed on the stories, but everyone agreed on one thing. Silas Carter lived alone in the mountains, came to town only a few times each year, bought supplies without wasting words, and disappeared before anyone could ask questions. No woman had ever accepted his offer. Until Abigail. Not because she dreamed of romance, because she could see what was happening at home. Her father had begun skipping meals, pretending he had already eaten. Her younger brothers had started asking for smaller pieces of bread before supper was served. Her mother spent evenings sewing clothes for neighbors by lamplight just to earn enough flour for another week. Abigail knew the numbers no one spoke aloud. They would not survive another winter. 3 days after speaking with the preacher, she gave her answer. The wedding was set for Saturday morning. No celebration followed. No music. No feast. Just a short ceremony inside the little white church at the edge of town. On the morning of the wedding, Abigail woke before sunrise. Her mother laid the old wedding dress across the bed. It had belonged to her 23 years earlier. The sleeves had been shortened, the waist pulled tighter. Time had yellowed the fabric, but it was still the finest thing Abigail had ever worn. Neither woman spoke while she dressed. There were no promises that everything would work out. No stories about love growing with time. Both of them knew this marriage was an exchange. A husband for security, a daughter for survival. When they stepped outside, the wagon waiting near the gate belonged to the preacher. Her father helped her climb inside. He squeezed her hand only once. "I wish I could have given you another choice." Those were the last words he spoke before the church came into view. The wooden building was already filling with people. Not because they cared about the wedding, because they wanted to see the man everyone feared. Silas Carter stood near the front beside the preacher. He was taller than Abigail expected. Broad shoulders, dark hair brushing the collar of his coat, a full beard. His face showed nothing. He watched the doorway as she entered, then lowered his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't stare. He simply waited. Whispers spread through the pews. "She's too young. Poor girl. It won't last a year. I heard he sleeps with a rifle beside his bed. My cousin says he's buried 2 wives. None of it came from people who actually knew him." The preacher opened his Bible. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. When asked to speak his vows, Silas answered in a steady voice, "I will." Nothing more. When the preacher announced them husband and wife, nobody clapped. The room remained quiet. Abigail looked toward the back of the church. Her mother was crying silently. Her father kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Outside, Silas untied his horse and secured Abigail's smaller mare behind it. He lifted her travel bag into place before offering a hand to help her mount. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. "The ride is long." His voice was calm. We'll stop before dark. That was all. No awkward conversation. No attempt to impress her. No promises about the future. He turned his horse toward the mountains. Abigail looked back one last time. Her family stood in front of the church, growing smaller with every step. The ride north was quiet. Silas never hurried the horses. He kept a steady pace that spared them unnecessary strain, stopping only to water them at creeks and let them graze along the trail. Abigail tried more than once to begin a conversation. How much farther? By tomorrow evening. A few miles later she asked, "Have you always lived in the mountains?" "For several years." His answers ended there. Not because he sounded angry, because he never seemed to use more words than he needed. By midday they reached a trading post where travelers stopped for supplies before heading deeper into the high country. The storekeeper looked up from stacking flour sacks and froze when he recognized Silas. "You don't come down often." "No." The man glanced toward Abigail. "So, you finally found yourself a wife." Silas paid for coffee, dried meat, lamp oil, and a new blanket. He never answered the remark. As they left, Abigail noticed two women standing outside the general store watching them. One whispered something. The other looked at Abigail with sympathy. Neither smiled. The mountains grew taller as the afternoon passed. The air cooled. Pine trees replaced open fields. The road narrowed until only wagon tracks remained. Near sunset the wind turned sharp. Abigail pulled her shawl tighter, but the cold slipped through the thin fabric. Without stopping, Silas removed the heavy wool coat from behind his saddle and handed it across. "You'll need this." "What about you?" "I've known colder." She hesitated. "It isn't proper for me to. It isn't safe without it." There was nothing romantic in his voice, only quiet certainty. She accepted the coat. It still carried the scent of cedar smoke and pine. As darkness settled over the mountains, Silas led the horses into a small clearing beside a stream. "We'll stay here." He unpacked quickly. Within minutes a small fire burned between two flat stones. He handed her a tin cup of hot coffee and a plate of beans with fresh bread. "You should eat." She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. When supper was finished, Silas spread one bedroll inside a small canvas shelter he carried behind the saddle. Then he rolled another blanket beside the fire. Abigail looked from one to the other. "Aren't you coming inside?" "No. You'll freeze. I've slept outside most of my life." She wanted to ask why. Instead, she watched him add another log to the fire. "You'll be warm in there," he said. Those were the last words he spoke before wrapping himself in the blanket. Abigail lay awake for hours listening to the wind moving through the pine trees. She had expected fear. Instead, she felt something she couldn't explain. Confusion. Every warning she'd heard in Willow Creek painted Silas Carter as a hard man. Yet since the wedding he had done nothing except make sure she was warm, fed, and safe. He had not crossed a single boundary. Not even once. Just before dawn, she heard movement outside. Silas was already saddling the horses. A pot of coffee warmed over fresh coals. He had been awake long before sunrise. They rode again while mist still covered the valley. The trail climbed higher. Snow remained in patches beneath the trees, even though spring had already reached Willow Creek weeks earlier. Around noon, they came upon a narrow wooden bridge crossing a fast mountain river. Halfway across, Abigail's mare stumbled on the wet planks. The frightened horse lurched sideways. Abigail lost one stirrup. For one terrifying second, she felt herself slipping toward the rushing water below. Before she could cry out, Silas was beside her. He caught the mare's bridle with one hand and steadied Abigail with the other. The horse settled almost immediately. "You all right?" She nodded, still trying to catch her breath. "You can let go," she whispered. He released the bridle at once and stepped back as though afraid of making her uncomfortable. They crossed the bridge without another word. That evening the mountains finally opened into a broad valley. Smoke curled from the chimney of a lone log cabin near a large ranch house. A weathered red barn stood beyond it. Several horses grazed inside a fenced pasture. Everything was neat. Everything had been carefully maintained. It wasn't the lonely shack Abigail had imagined. It looked like someone had spent years building a home. Silas slowed his horse. "We're here." Abigail studied the cabin. One question had been growing inside her since they left Willow Creek. Now she could no longer keep it to herself. She looked at the man she had married less than 2 days earlier, then quietly asked, "Silas, why did every person in town look at me as though I was riding towards something terrible?" Silas was silent for several seconds. When he finally answered, he didn't look at her, because they never cared enough to learn the truth. He rode toward the cabin. Abigail followed. She had no idea that before sunrise, she would be crying into her pillow, wondering if she had married a man she would never truly know. Silas tied the horses outside the barn before carrying Abigail's travel bag into the cabin. "Come in." She stepped across the doorway expecting darkness and neglect. Instead, she found a home. The floor had been swept. Fresh firewood was stacked beside the stone fireplace. A kettle rested over glowing coals. The shelves were lined with jars of dried beans, flour, coffee, and preserves. A quilt lay neatly folded across a narrow bed beneath the window. Nothing looked abandoned. Nothing looked careless. It surprised her. "I wasn't expecting this." Silas hung his coat on a wooden peg. "I keep things in order." He opened a cupboard and took down 2 bowls. "Supper will be ready soon." Abigail offered to help. "What can I do?" "Sit. You've ridden enough." Within minutes, he served venison stew with fresh bread he had baked before riding to Willow Creek for the wedding. Abigail looked at the loaf in surprise. "You baked this?" "Yesterday." "You cook?" "I eat." It was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him. She almost smiled. The silence between them no longer felt frightening, only unfamiliar. After supper, she reached for the bowls. "I can wash these." "I'll do them." "You've already done everything else. You'll have plenty of work tomorrow." He carried the dishes to a basin without another word. Abigail wandered slowly around the cabin. Near the fireplace stood a sturdy rocking chair worn smooth by years of use. Beside it rested a shelf filled with books. She ran a finger across the spines. A Bible, a book of hymns, 2 history books, a volume of Shakespeare, several well-read novels. She hadn't expected that either. On the wall hung a framed photograph, faded with age. Before she could study it, Silas quietly removed it and placed it face down on a nearby table. "I'm sorry," she said. "I wasn't trying to pry." "I know." His voice remained calm. Some memories, she realized, still hurt. Night settled over the valley. The only sounds came from the crackling fire and the wind brushing against the cabin walls. Silas walked to a small door near the back of the room. He opened it. Behind it was a narrow lean-to with just enough space for another bed. "I'll sleep out here." Abigail stared at him. "There isn't enough room." "There is." "Then why?" "I think you'll rest easier." She searched his face for an answer. "Are you afraid of me?" "No." "Then are you disappointed?" For the first time since they met, Silas hesitated. "No." He looked toward the fire instead of at her. "I gave my word to your father." She frowned. "My father? He asked one thing of me." Silas's voice dropped. He said, "She doesn't know you. Don't ask her to trust you all at once. Let her decide for herself whether you're worthy of it." Abigail hadn't known her father had spoken to him. Silas continued, "I promised him I would." With that, he stepped into the lean-to and quietly closed the door. Abigail remained standing beside the fire. Everything she had expected had been wrong. The man everyone called dangerous had shown her nothing but respect. He had fed her, kept her warm, given her the only bed, and now he had chosen to sleep in a cramped wooden room so she would not feel afraid. She changed into her nightdress and sat on the edge of the bed. The cabin was almost silent. Then she noticed something resting on the pillow. A small wooden bird. It had been carved by hand. Every feather had been shaped with patient care. She turned it over. On the bottom were tiny initials. E.C. Not hers. Not Silas's. She looked toward the closed lean-to door. Who was E.C.? Why had he left the carving for her? And why did it look as though someone had held it for years? The questions followed her as she lay down. Outside, she heard Silas adding another log to the fire. He wasn't sleeping. He was making sure the cabin stayed warm. Abigail clutched the little wooden bird against her chest. The tears came without warning. Not because she had been mistreated. Not because she regretted the marriage. She cried because she suddenly understood how unfairly she had judged the man sleeping on the other side of the wall. Yet one mystery remained. If Silas Carter had such a gentle heart, why did an entire town fear him? And who was E.C., the name carved into the little wooden bird he had left on her pillow? Abigail woke before sunrise. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the cabin. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the main room. Silas was already dressed for work. A skillet of biscuits rested beside the fire. He placed a cup on the table. "Morning." She looked toward the lean-to. You've been awake long? Since first light. You didn't have to make breakfast. I was making mine anyway. Again, there was nothing remarkable about the words. Yet every small kindness made the stories from Willow Creek harder to believe. As they ate, Abigail reached into her apron pocket and placed the little wooden bird on the table. I found this on my pillow. Silas looked at it, but didn't touch it. I know. You left it there. Yes. She turned it over. Who is EC? The question hung between them. Silas slowly picked up the carving. His thumb brushed across the worn initials. My daughter. The answer came so quietly she almost missed it. Abigail froze. You have a daughter? I had one. Silence settled over the room. He set the carving back on the table. Her name was Emma. He stood before Abigail could ask another question. The horses need feeding. Then he walked outside. The door closed behind him. Abigail remained seated, staring at the tiny bird. Everything she thought she knew about her husband had changed again. No one in Willow Creek had ever mentioned a daughter. No one had mentioned a family. Only rumors. Only fear. Later that morning, she carried fresh water from the creek while Silas repaired a section of fence. The ranch stretched farther than she expected. A vegetable garden stood behind the cabin. An orchard was beginning to bloom. The barn had been carefully maintained. Nothing suggested a man who had given up on life. Near the edge of the property, she noticed something beneath a large cottonwood tree. Two small wooden crosses, weathered by years of snow and rain. Fresh wildflowers had been placed in front of them. She stopped walking. One cross read, Emily Carter. The other, Emma Carter. Abigail felt her breath catch. So there had been a wife. And a little girl. She had barely taken another step when she heard Silas behind her. You shouldn't blame yourself. She turned quickly. I wasn't trying to pry. I know. His eyes rested on the graves. They've been there a long time. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Abigail asked the question that had weighed on her heart since breakfast. What happened? Silas looked toward the mountains. The winter. Nothing more. She waited. He didn't continue. It was clear the memory still carried too much pain. That afternoon, a rider appeared at the ranch. An older man climbed down from his horse carrying a sack of seed. He smiled warmly at Abigail. You must be Mrs. Carter. She nodded. I'm Owen Miller. He shook her hand before turning toward Silas. I figured your potatoes would need planting. Silas accepted the sack. Thank you. Owen laughed. You know, that's the longest sentence you've spoken to me in years. Abigail smiled. It was the first person she had seen speak comfortably with her husband. While Silas unloaded supplies into the barn, Owen lowered his voice. So how are you settling in? Better than I expected. I suppose the town filled your head with stories. She admitted they had. Owen sighed. They've judged that man for years. Why? Because people would rather believe gossip than ask questions. He glanced toward the graves beneath the cottonwood tree. When Silas lost his wife and little girl, he stopped coming to town except for supplies. The story started after that. They got worse every year. Owen shook his head. Folks called him cold because he stopped smiling. They called him dangerous because he preferred being alone. They forgot grief can make a person quiet without making them cruel. Before Abigail could ask anything else, another horse came racing toward the ranch. The rider barely slowed before shouting. Silas! Silas stepped from the barn. What happened? The north fence is down. The young ranch hand struggled to catch his breath. Half the herd is heading toward Miller's Ridge. Silas was already saddling his horse. He looked at Abigail. I'll be back before dark. Then he and the young man disappeared into the hills. Abigail watched until they were no longer visible. She didn't know it yet, but before the sun rose again, she would discover that someone in Willow Creek had hidden far more than the truth about Silas Carter's family. Silas returned well after dark. His clothes were damp from the river. Mud covered his boots. One sleeve had been torn by barbed brush, but every horse had been brought back. Abigail had supper waiting. He thanked her with a quiet nod before sitting at the table. You found them, every one. You must be exhausted. I've had longer days. He ate slowly, then reached into his coat pocket and placed a small cloth pouch on the table. For you. Abigail looked at him. You didn't have to bring me anything. I passed the trading post. Inside the pouch were a handful of peppermint candies. She smiled despite herself. You remembered I liked these? You bought them after the wedding. She hadn't even noticed he was paying attention. They finished supper in comfortable silence. It no longer felt awkward. For the first time since the wedding, the cabin felt like a home instead of a stranger's house. The next morning, while sweeping the loft above the barn, Abigail noticed a loose floorboard beneath an old trunk. She pulled it aside. Underneath lay a small wooden box wrapped in faded cloth. She hesitated. It wasn't locked. Inside were dozens of letters tied together with a blue ribbon. The handwriting on the first envelope was careful and elegant. To my dear Emily. Abigail's heart raced. She almost closed the box. Instead, she unfolded the first letter. It wasn't from Silas. It was from Emily's father. He thanked his daughter for marrying a good and honest man. He wrote that Silas had rebuilt the family farm with his own hands after a fire destroyed it. He called him dependable, gentle, patient. Every word painted the opposite picture from the rumors in Willow Creek. Abigail opened another letter, then another. Each one spoke of Silas helping neighbors during storms, repairing barns without asking for payment, delivering food to widows after harsh winters, watching sick children while their fathers searched for doctors. No one called him dangerous. No one called him cruel. Every letter described the same man, a quiet man who simply hated attention. At the bottom of the box lay a folded newspaper. Its edges had turned brown with age. The headline caught her eye. Local rancher blamed for tragic winter deaths. She unfolded it carefully. The article claimed Silas had insisted on crossing the mountain during a blizzard despite warnings. It suggested his decision had cost his wife and daughter their lives. Abigail felt her stomach tighten. So that was why the town blamed him. She continued reading. The article never mentioned where the information came from. It offered no witness, only accusations. Just then she heard Owen Miller's wagon approaching the ranch. She carried the newspaper outside. "Owen, may I ask you something?" He looked at the headline and sighed heavily. "I wondered if you'd find that. Is it true?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Then why would anyone print it?" "Because people wanted someone to blame." He climbed down from the wagon. The truth never sold as many newspapers as gossip. What really happened? Owen leaned against the fence. Emily became sick. Very sick. The doctor lived nearly 30 miles away. Silas rode through a blizzard to bring him back. He nearly froze to death doing it. Abigail looked down at the newspaper. But it says what people believed. The doctor couldn't reach the ranch in time. Emily died. A day later, little Emma caught the same fever. Owen lowered his eyes. Silas buried them both before spring. Abigail could barely breathe. He wasn't responsible. He spent years blaming himself. Owen's voice softened. The rest of the town made sure he never forgot. Abigail folded the newspaper. Every cruel whisper, every frightened stare, every rumor she had heard inside Willow Creek had been built on a lie. That evening she watched Silas repairing the front gate. His hands moved with practiced care, the same hands the town had called dangerous. She suddenly realized something that made her chest ache. Not once, since the day they married, had Silas ever tried to defend himself. He had simply carried the blame. Alone. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Abigail made a quiet promise to herself. If the whole town had chosen to believe the worst about her husband, then she would spend the rest of her life learning the truth. What she didn't know was that someone from Willow Creek was already riding toward the ranch. And the visitor wasn't coming to apologize. He was coming to finish what the rumors had started. 3 days passed peacefully. Abigail learned the rhythm of the ranch. She baked bread before sunrise, gathered eggs from the hen house, helped mend torn shirts, fed the chickens. By evening, she and Silas shared supper while the fire crackled between them. They still spoke little, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt comfortable. Each day revealed another side of the man she had married. If a fence needed repair, he fixed it before breakfast. If a neighbor's calf wandered onto his land, he returned it before anyone noticed it missing. If a traveler passed the ranch hungry, there was always an extra plate waiting. He never spoke about kindness. He simply practiced it. Late one afternoon, the sound of galloping horses broke the quiet valley. Silas looked up from splitting firewood. A rider appeared through the trees. The horse stopped hard in front of the cabin. The rider climbed down without greeting either of them. Abigail recognized him immediately. Harold Briggs, the wealthiest cattle buyer in Willow Creek. She remembered seeing him near the church on her wedding day. He hadn't looked sorry for her. He had looked satisfied. "Silas, what do you want?" "I've come to make another offer." "I already gave you my answer." Harold smiled. I'm hoping your new wife has more sense. Silas rested the axe against the chopping block. My answer hasn't changed. Harold turned toward Abigail. Do you know where you're living? She glanced around the valley. Yes. You're standing on land worth more than every farm in Willow Creek combined. She frowned. I don't understand. Harold pointed toward the northern ridge. The railroad is coming. Abigail looked at Silas. He said nothing. Harold continued. When the surveyors finish, they'll need this valley. They've already bought nearly every ranch nearby. They only need this one. And your husband keeps refusing. Abigail looked back at Silas. You never mentioned this. There wasn't any reason. Harold laughed. Tell her the whole story. Silas remained silent. So Harold did it for him. I've offered him enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. He won't sell. Do you know why? Abigail waited. Because his wife and daughter are buried here. The words hung in the air. Harold folded his arms. Dead people don't need mountains. They don't need land. The living do. Silas finally spoke. They're staying. Harold's smile disappeared. You've always been stubborn. And it cost your family once already. The moment the words left his mouth, Abigail saw something she had never seen before. Pain. Not anger. Pain. It flashed across Silas's face for only a second. Then it was gone. Harold mounted his horse. You'll change your mind. No. You don't have much choice. I've made mine. Harold pulled the reins. Before riding away, he looked directly at Abigail. Ask your husband who convinced the newspaper to print those stories years ago. Then he disappeared down the trail. Silence returned. Abigail slowly turned toward Silas. He was lying. Silas didn't answer. He was lying, wasn't he? Silas stared toward the distant graves beneath the cottonwood tree. I never asked. You never asked what? Who started the rumors? Abigail couldn't believe what she was hearing. You never wanted to know? I already had enough to carry. She stepped closer. But if what he said is true, Silas looked at her for the first time. It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. He lowered his eyes. I buried my family. I wasn't interested in fighting the town too. That answer stayed with Abigail long after he walked back to the barn. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She sat beside the window watching moonlight cover the valley. One question kept returning. Why had Harold Briggs wanted the ranch so badly? It couldn't be only the railroad. There had to be something more. The next morning, Owen Miller arrived before sunrise. His face was pale. You need to saddle your horses. Silas stepped onto the porch. What happened? They've started digging near the North Ridge. For what? Owen looked from Silas to Abigail. They're not looking for railroad markers. They're looking for gold. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. Suddenly everything made sense. The rumors, the newspaper, the pressure to sell, the sudden visit. Someone had spent years trying to drive Silas Carter off his land. And if Harold Briggs had gone that far already, there was no telling what he would do next. The morning after Harold Briggs leaves the ranch, Owen Miller tells Abigail the truth. Harold had owned shares in the newspaper that blamed Silas for Emily and Emma's deaths. He knew the valley would become valuable one day and believed that if Silas carried enough shame, he would eventually abandon the ranch. Abigail refuses to let the lie continue. She rides into Willow Creek alone. She first visits the elderly doctor who had struggled through the blizzard years earlier. He tells her Silas did everything possible to save his wife. The storm, not Silas, claimed Emily's life. Emma fell ill shortly afterward, and despite every effort, she could not be saved. The preacher confirms that after the funerals, Silas stopped defending himself. Every time someone repeated the rumors, he simply walked away. The blacksmith remembers Silas repairing wagons for struggling families without accepting payment. An older widow recalls that Silas secretly left food on her porch every winter after her husband died. Piece by piece, Abigail realizes the town had judged one quiet man by gossip instead of truth. That Sunday, after church, Abigail asks the preacher for permission to speak. The church falls silent as she tells everyone what she has learned. She reads the doctor's written statement. She reads Emily's father's letters describing Silas as an honest, gentle husband. Then she folds the papers and says, "For years you've called my husband cold. The only thing cold was the way this town treated a grieving man." No one answers. Many lower their eyes. Harold Briggs quietly slips out the back door before the service ends. For the first time in years, Willow Creek begins questioning the story it had always believed. But Abigail knows one apology still matters more than all the others. Abigail returns to the ranch before sunset. Silas is repairing the pasture fence, exactly as she expected. She tells him everything. The doctor, the preacher, the letters, the church, the silence that followed. Silas says nothing for a long moment. Finally, he asks, "Why would you do all that?" She smiles. "Because someone should have done it years ago." Several days later, wagons begin arriving at the ranch. The preacher comes first, then the doctor, then neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid Silas. One by one, they apologize. Silas doesn't dwell on the past. He simply shakes each hand and welcomes them onto the ranch. Even Harold Briggs loses everything. When the truth about the false stories becomes known, no one in Willow Creek is willing to do business with him again. He leaves town with his reputation ruined, while Silas never asks for revenge. That evening, Abigail and Silas sit together on the porch as the sun disappears behind the mountains. She looks toward the cabin and quietly laughs. "Do you remember our first night here?" "I do. I cried until morning." "I know. I thought you didn't want me." Silas looks toward the two small graves beneath the cottonwood tree. "I was afraid if I walked into that room, I'd ask you to carry a grief that wasn't yours. I thought the kindest thing I could do was give you space until you chose this life for yourself." Abigail reaches for his hand. "You never gave me your grief. You gave me your kindness." Months later, laughter once again fills the ranch. The rocking chair by the fireplace is no longer empty. The cabin that once echoed with silence has become a home. People in Willow Creek stop calling Silas the coldest rancher in Montana. Instead, they remember him as the man who loved so deeply that losing his family nearly convinced the world he had no heart left. And whenever young brides ask Abigail if she was frightened on her wedding night, she smiles and says, "I cried because I believed the town. The happiest day of my life began the morning I stopped believing everyone else and started believing my husband." If this story touched you tonight, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. There are so many more stories like this waiting for you here, and I'd love for you to be here for every single one of them.